I'll be talking here about differences in federal spending on transportation between the US, Australia, and Canada. I want to be clear here from the beginning that I'm not suggesting that the Australian and Canadian feds don't spend on transportation or that they don't spend on public transport, and I'm not even saying that they don't spend on roads. I'm just saying that the funding for limited access highways and the development of a national highway network has been ad hoc at best. And the same would go for a national network of rail in either of those countries. Okay, so I recently came across this old article on Vox entitled, "The Real Reason American Public Transportation is Such a Disaster." I love it more than I hate it. I love it because it acknowledges that it's not necessary for everyone to live in a replica of Manhattan or Berlin to have better transit ridership, driven by better transit systems. And by better, I mean more frequent service. It also correctly identifies the period where the US diverged from its peers, even if it goes off the rails shortly thereafter. I hate it because it falls back on moralism, and in doing so, it gets why Canada and Australia have mostly better transit completely wrong. And it's important to get the why right if you want to come up with a solution that's going to fix the problem that you perceive. Now, moral crusades are not going to improve transit in the US, but good policy will. The problem for the Vox article, because it doesn't address it, is that the quote-unquote policy in Canada and Australia has actually been a non-policy. That is to say that the position of the federal government in both countries has been more or less your state, your problem, your money. Tony Abbott, the former Australian Prime Minister, once said that the Australian federal government should, quote, stick to its knitting, end quote, by sticking to roads and staying out of public transport. In other words, expressways in Australia and Canada weren't built in the 1950s and 1960s, not because no one wanted them or because there was some policy decision to not build them, but rather because there was no money to build them. And I'm not trying to say that the federal governments in Australia or Canada were broke. They certainly weren't. It's just that the federal governments didn't see it as their jobs to spend money on transportation that state governments should be taking care of. And so they didn't. And that's been more or less the status quo up until the present day. We can go back to the 1960s, in particular 1965 in Brisbane. That's the capital of the state of Queensland in Australia. You'll find their 1965 plan for freeways, and it looks exactly like what you'd expect an American freeway plan to look like in the 1960s. In fact, it was drawn up by an American company specifically hired for that purpose. In the 1950s, the US was an urban industrial juggernaut unparalleled in the world. It was flush with cash. In the 1950s, Australia and Canada were definitely prosperous, but they weren't necessarily capable of multiple continent-spanning infrastructure projects. By the late 1960s, the freeway revolts were already in full swing in cities all over the world. Canadian and Australian cities were no exceptions. So by the time Australian states and Canadian provinces got their money together to pull off big freeway projects in their major cities, the opposition to freeways was already well organized and the political calculus had to change. That doesn't mean the calculus changed completely. Expressways and motorways still got built. They were just likely to be pushed directly through downtown. It's clear in comparing the proposed and current maps that the wide-eyed, pedal-to-the-floor vision of Brisbane motorways didn't materialize. But then it didn't materialize in Philadelphia either. There's a map of Philadelphia called a Comprehensive Plan for Expressways from the 1960s. It's full of dashed lines running all over the city. Only one of them got built. Canada doesn't have better transit ridership because Canada has a better transit policy. It has better transit ridership because it never had an interstate program. It never had an interstate program because, in comparison to their southern neighbors, their cities were small, few, and far between. Australian cities are even more remote than their Canadian counterparts. A road trip from one city to another in Australia is a vacation in and of itself. It's a 9-hour drive from Sydney to Melbourne and nearly 10 from Sydney to Brisbane, and there's really not much in between. So, as in Australia, the Canadian federal government left transportation decisions up to the provinces. The provincial governments left the decisions up to the cities. Vancouver, constrained to 2/3 of a wedge-shaped valley by ocean on the west, mountains to the north, and an international border to the south, chose a transit-forward approach. On the other hand, Cities like Edmonton, Winnipeg, and especially Calgary have had a very US-esque urban freeway system minus the downtown blitz. The transit systems in those cities are generally better than their US counterparts, not because they've always been better, but rather because of the point in their growth trajectory that they started taking transit seriously. Calgary and Salt Lake City have a similar metropolitan population. The amount of light rail in Calgary is actually a little less than in similarly sized Salt Lake City. Since Calgary's transit system carries more than 3 times the passengers of Salt Lake, Calgary has a bus fleet that's almost twice the size of Salt Lake's. That discrepancy in bus fleet size is more of an indication of the unused capacity on Salt Lake buses and trains as it is to crowding in Calgary. Calgary spends about $444 million Canadian per year on operations, while Salt Lake spends around $396 million US. It's not an important difference given Calgary's larger fleet and higher ridership. Salt Lake City has a slightly larger capital budget, but I suspect that's because it has more rail than Calgary, and it also may be why the ops budgets are so close. So what's the story? The capital budgets are fairly equal, the operation spending is fairly equal. Why does Calgary have triple the ridership? Because Calgary has triple the downtown employment. Pre-COVID employment numbers in downtown Salt Lake were around 46,000, while in Calgary they were around 140,000. If we look at Adelaide and South Australia, very similar in population to its North American counterparts, we see about double the transit ridership compared to Salt Lake. We also see about 115,000 jobs in the Adelaide Central Business District. Washington, D.C. has less than half the downtown jobs versus the Sydney CBD. Boston has less than half the downtown jobs versus Melbourne. I could do this all day. We've known this for decades. Jobs within walking distance of transit equals transit riders. The data is everywhere, ready to slap anyone in the face who dares to look. You can try it with DC, you can try it with Chicago, you can look at Sydney. Data and reports are easily available. You might be tempted to say that, well, people in those countries or in those cities just thought differently, and so they took a different tack. But they didn't. Contemporary thinking about solutions to urban problems wasn't different in the US, Canada, or Australia back in the 1930s. It wasn't in the 1960s. It wasn't in the 1990s. And it wasn't different today. You can go to virtually any period over the last 100 years and see people building and using exactly the same transportation technology.
All eyes turn to the Westgate Bridge today for the opening of the $200 million East-West link. The bridge is tonight carrying thousands of commuters, and on the scene is Paul Jenkins with our live eye unit. Paul, what's been the response of the motorists generally to the bridge tonight?
The volume apparently has exceeded all expectations here, and the Westgate Bridge Authority is delighted with the result so far. They see this as quite a vote of confidence in the bridge.
So what was different was the money that was available and the size and shape of the economies in those cities. By the time Canadian and Australian cities were booming into the modern service-based economies that they are today, the thinking around cities had changed. It also changed in the US and right around the same time. The difference is that the suburban retail, office, and warehousing booms of the 60s and 70s in the US had hollowed out the urban core. A lot of this comes down to advances in technology and how we move freight and other goods. That was able to take off really quickly in the US because of the highway system. And I'm not just talking about interstates, I'm talking about the US highway system that predated the interstates. And also because of how close together our cities were. It's a topic for another episode. I'll definitely get into it, but keep that in mind for now. Those same advances in freight technology happened in Canada and Australia at the same time. So Sydney, Melbourne, and Toronto were under the same pressure, but the pressure wasn't as extreme as it was in the US. Also, at least for the US, a lot of the difference in where retail and office is down to transportation. Not just public transport, but also freight. But some of it comes down to the how and the if of mixed-use lending. This has been a problem in the US for a long time. It got a patch during the Obama administration, but still isn't completely fixed. So if you're following me here, I'm saying that the real reason US transit ridership is so low is because so much employment is in the suburbs. Now, a lot of people will tell you, oh, well, there was all this employment flight in the 50s and 60s to the suburbs. But that's not exactly true. If we look at Philadelphia and its suburbs, for example, the overwhelming majority of jobs are in the suburbs and not in Philadelphia County. Philadelphia has 834,000 jobs, but that's in the entirety of the city. If we're just talking about jobs in the downtown core area, it's only about a third of that number. But when we keep looking at the numbers, we see that Philly hasn't lost that many jobs over the last 50 years. It stayed fairly consistent. What has happened is that all of the job growth has been in the suburbs. That's not unique to Philadelphia. That's fairly common in all US cities. What's different for most Canadian and Australian cities is that the retail and office growth wasn't entirely in the suburbs. Canadian and Australian cities were able to capture a lot of that growth. US cities don't actually spend that much less on transit, but our fare box recovery ratios are lower because ridership is lower because fewer people work downtown. It's a negative feedback loop that results in less service, which results in fewer riders, which results in less fare revenue, which results in less service, which results in fewer riders, which results in less fare revenue. We don't lack nice things because we're backwards, evil people. We lack nice things because back in the 1950s, we had the money to build crazy, wide-eyed infrastructure projects that are just no longer fashionable. And they're not just no longer fashionable, they're no longer practical. We built a new world around highways when it seemed cool, and now we're stuck with the consequences of those out-of-fashion decisions. So if we go back to the post-World War II period, the big Canadian cities of Toronto and Montreal had extensive streetcar networks. Subway planning, largely as a replacement for aging and crowded streetcars, began in the immediate post-war period. This is more or less the same thing that happened in San Francisco and DC. But all four of those cities also already had extensive suburbs, and so freeway building was also fairly robust through the 1950s and 60s. Cities like Calgary, on the other hand, were relatively small and didn't get light rail until May of 1981. The thinking in the US at the time wasn't any different. The light rail system in San Diego opened in July of 1981. The difference is that in 81, San Diego was nearly 3 times larger than Calgary and already had decades of freeway development. Like the Canadian government, the Australian federal government has long been allergic to funding urban infrastructure. Australian cities typically have a well-developed commuter rail network. Sydney has a middling urban core transit system. Melbourne has a good one. Compared to cities like Denver or Dallas, Aussie cities have a slimmed-down expressway network, primarily consisting of toll roads with a copious amount of tunnels. U.S. cities of a comparable size to Sydney and Melbourne, like Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Philly, all have relatively low rates of freeway lane miles per capita, and they all have decent transit systems comparable to Australian cities. But all three of those cities have far fewer downtown jobs than Sydney or Melbourne or even Toronto. Sydney had a relatively well-functioning tram network that it systematically shut down over a 12-year period from 1949 to 1961. The troubles in Sydney were the same as anywhere. The system was old and ridership was down. The city couldn't afford to both repair the system and to plug the ever-widening gap in fare revenue. Brisbane had similar troubles, although it started later.
Brisbane, like Melbourne, still has its trams, but how long will they last? Opinion in the Queensland capital seems to be that the trams will be replaced by buses as they have been in other Australian capitals. The tramway system overhead wiring is also used to operate a small number of trolley buses. They'd be doomed too if the trams disappear. It would be the end of an era. And the supporters of the tramway system say that trams move more people faster than buses. Those who want buses say that trams delay all the traffic.
The long demise of trams in Brisbane was cut short when a mysterious fire broke out in the trolley barn on a Friday evening, when 20% of all the trams in the fleet happened to be parked there.
Brisbane has 260 tram cars in operation. 4 miles of track have been closed in the last 5 years, but this was caused by a tram depot fire at Paddington, which destroyed a number of cars. The tram system covers the city and suburbs, but how long will it last? Will Brisbane follow Sydney and other capitals and replace its trams with buses? Or will it, like Melbourne, keep the trams? Only the future can provide the answer.
The late mayor, Clem Jones, was outspokenly critical of the tram network, and also outspokenly pro-car. He now has a freeway tunnel named after him that empties out into a rat's nest of ramps just north of the Brisbane CBD.
The Clem 7 is Brisbane's first major road tunnel and forms the start of the new M7 motorway. Named after Brisbane's longest-serving mayor, Clem Jones, and the M7, the Clem 7 aims to take pressure off Brisbane's congested road network and is itself nothing short of an engineering marvel.
What's different in Australian cities compared to Canadian cities and makes them more like a Chicago, a Boston, or Philadelphia is that they had, maintained, and grew their regional rail networks. Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne have well-functioning S-Bahn-type systems, while Toronto is playing catch-up and LA is working on the Link Us project so that they too can have one. Philadelphia is an outlier here in North America. It's had a similar system since 1984, where all suburban trains pass through the same central stations, and a train can run from the northern suburbs through Center City and out to the southern suburbs on the other side. The problem in Sydney and Brisbane, because they lost their trams and didn't build subways, has been the lack of urban core rapid transit service. This fostered an over-reliance on the trunk of the suburban network to pick up the slack and resulted in some serious capacity issues. Imagine Philly, Toronto, or Boston without subways and with everyone crowding onto the suburban trains instead.
If you think your train ride to work is getting squishier, you're right. New figures revealing more than half of Sydney train lines are full to the brink during the early peak.
Sydney opened Australia's first metro line just 4 years ago. And here's where we need to dig deeper into the history, because there's a point in the Vox article where it leans on this trope of, quote, people see public transit as welfare, end quote. Now, if we're talking about Augusta, Georgia, or Traverse City, Michigan, then sure, maybe. But we're comparing big cities here, where many people choose transit as an alternative to traffic and or expensive parking. In most large metros, and by large I mean about 1 million people or more, there's been an active effort in the US to create a regional transit system, and most local politicians understand on some level that it's a necessary part of being a big city. No one in Denver or Seattle or Salt Lake has been thinking that they need to spend billions on a welfare rail system as they spent billions on huge rail systems. The problem isn't a lack of local will, and as far as I can tell, it hasn't been for at least 40 years. Subway planning in LA, Miami, and Atlanta began more than 50 years ago. Yeah, there have been political problems along the way, but more often than not, there are financial problems. The problem as I see it is not in the capital program spending. It's for decades been a lack of state and federal funding for operations. It's one thing to get the system built, but it's a totally different story to keep them running. I think as a society, Americans get over-exuberant about new things and assume they'll replace the old things overnight. It's easy to focus on the shiny new thing and throw money at it. And that's what we did with cars because railroads were a big problem for a long time. Back in 1926, we already had a great highway starter system. In the 1950s, rather than improve and complete what we already had, we went and built an entirely new parallel interstate system. Our population has almost tripled since 1926, and automobile technology has improved by leaps and bounds. So I'm not saying we didn't need any additional roads. I do know for certain that we needed better roads. What I am saying is that the highway routes we already had should have been the foundation of a new interstate type system. I'm also saying that we should not have spent hundreds of billions of dollars on urban interstates. If states wanted urban interstates, they should have paid to build them. Or at the very least, the calculus should have been inverted for urban expressways, with the Federal Highway Administration paying 10 or 20% and the state and local governments funding the other 80 to 90. If that happened, our cities would probably look a little more Australian-y.
Does she look Australian-y? Not particularly, no. Only in the face, I suppose, but not bodily.
This also goes back to what Jane Jacobs called cataclysmic money. When there's so much money in play that a line drawn on a map can become the reality that bulldozes through a city, bad things happen. If it had been up to the states and their own pot of money, we would have had far fewer miles of urban expressways. The primary purpose of any federal highway program should have been to connect the country by linking rural areas to their primary markets in nearby urban areas. This is how you support a rural economy. Instead, as mission creep set in, the effect became to connect cities to each other, and later to connect cities to their own suburbs. Okay, I originally had this video at 25 minutes, but through editing and going back to add some context, I got out about 11 minutes over that. So I've decided to cut this into 2 videos. I still have some editing to do, but I expect to have part 2 out about 2 weeks from now. If you've enjoyed this, please subscribe. Questions, comments, and corrections are welcome below. I'll try to address them in the next video, if not in a separate video. I'm Jim. This is Urban Legends. Thanks for watching.